Hello. Today's discussion is ABC, or activity-based costing. And we're going to consider this topic using our Eastern Shore Milky Way Company case study. Well, before we get into the case study, one thing we can do in activity-based costing is come up with a plant-wide overhead rate. But while your book and some of the problems that you may see in homework address the plant-wide overhead rate, a plant-wide overhead rate is really only going to apply to a business that has a plant. And that's typically going to be a business that sells goods. So, as you know, in our Eastern Shore Milky Way Company, we're selling a service. We're selling a trip to the moon, some time on the moon, a trip back, and possibly even a trip down to the surface of the moon. So, an alternative we have to a plant-wide overhead rate, and even though we don't have a plant, the initial requirements of the case study came up with one overhead rate that we used for all overhead. And if you think about it, we had a lot of overhead. Most of what the company had in terms of cost was overhead. So department overhead rates are something that services can use. We can have multiple departments, and each department can have its overhead rate. So it's perfect for our space travel case. One of the things we need to do then is to divide up our overhead. So I'm using the expression divide up. Here in the case study on the slide it says divide, but we're talking about dividing up the overhead into departments and then creating separate rates for those departments. So in your current project requirement, I told you to design a flow chart. That was the weekly requirement or the periodic requirement, similar to Exhibit 17.5 in your book. Now, that's all that is missing. If you're looking at this slide right now, I have it nice and big, and I had to cut off where it just had the title Exhibit 17.5 for case study. So if you go and you look at your book and you see Exhibit 17.5, you're going to see that matching up very closely to this. And so, as I've told you before, one way you can handle this for your own case study is you could just simply copy what I have here on the slide. This is the answer. This page is one answer. But remember, in our case study, there is no one right answer. So that while this is a right answer, and you could just copy it, you could just as easily come up with your own right answer. So my answer is, okay, we have all these overhead costs. If we try to break the services that the company does into departments, we could at least break them into two. And I'm saying the two departments might be the transport department and the guest services department. Now, when the next slide comes up, I'll show you a number of costs I'm going to put into transport and a number of costs I'm going to put into guest services. But basically, if you think about all 10 of those costs we have in the case study, and the fact that 2 or 3 of them are direct costs, all the indirect costs, all the rest of them, 7 or 8 of them, will either fit into transport or into guest services, and I'll show you where I put them in the next slide. But the cost of the space vehicle itself, the cost of the insurances, the cost of the furniture, these might be things I put into the transport department. The items like the electronic gaming devices, the space hotel itself, the climate suits, these may be things that I would put into guest services rather than transport. This is somewhat arbitrary, and every company will do it differently, but this is how I've done it for purposes of this demonstration. So now I'm going to want a transportation rate and a guest services rate, like an overhead application rate. And then what the bottom shows is, if you look back at Exhibit 17.5, it says the company can have multiple products. And so far we've operated as if your company only has one product, the basic trip. But hopefully you see we could set it up very easily to have 3 products. We could have the trip, and everybody would have to buy that. We could have a day excursion set up as a separate product. And as I've talked to some of you individually about how to do your case study better, I've told you can consider pricing the day excursion separately and making it like an add-on. Everybody doing this has to get transported up to the moon, but only certain people who get to the moon might choose to go on a day excursion down to the surface of the planet. Remember how the case study works. And this is quite realistic, I think. In your lifetime, I do believe you will see vacation-type companies send people to orbit around the moon. But notice they will not go to the moon itself. Because the costs of getting a person into space and really taking any pound into space are so high, I believe the ships, much like commercial aircraft today, will be too small to be comfortable. So firms will make them as comfortable as possible. People will be able to spend the 3 days in the thing to get to the moon, but they're never going to be so comfortable that somebody would just have a great trip doing nothing but being on the ship. So you can't, for example, stay in orbit around the moon in the ship. It wouldn't be comfortable enough. So that's why the ship flies up. Then, much like the International Space Station, a space hotel floats around the planet. And then, if you want to take a day excursion to the surface of the moon, and I called it a planet, that's a mistake. I know my solar system science or my astronomy. You may or may not choose to take a smaller ship down and actually go walk on the moon like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin did in the 1960s. So, final note about the basic nature of a space trip. I don't believe in your lifetime. I mean, I just told you I do believe there will be commercial vacations to the moon, but I don't believe in your lifetime anybody will put buildings on the moon. So if you think about certain science fiction that might show cities being built on planets or a city being built on the moon, that technology is not available today. I don't expect it to be available in your lifetime. So the buildings will be floating and probably inflatable. We'll probably take them from Earth, kind of like inflatable balls or something like this, and inflate them when we get out there, and then leave them orbiting the moon, much like the International Space Station does. So the idea is then, in addition to the trip or the add-on excursion, we might give somebody the VIP treatment, both on the ship itself, might give them more leg room on the ship getting up there, like airlines do now, might give them first class, might give them drink coupons, special food, things like this, when we get to the space hotel itself, and we might charge an add-on fee for that. So here's an example of how I might divvy up the two departments. So transport, I might have the cost of the ship itself, and if you remember, that was $4 billion. But I decided the ship would last 10 years, and so the annual cost is $400 million. I put day excursion in, and then I took it back out, because in other parts of the case study, I've acted as if the day excursion was a direct cost, particularly when I had those 3 travelers and I gave you job cost sheets for them. So I decided to take it out as an overhead cost. It can't be both. It can't be both overhead and a direct cost. So then I have maintenance fixed at $40 million, and I added those two together and came up with overhead to be applied of $440 million. Now, before we continue on, go over to guest services and see what I put there. Here I have the devices, $150,000. The space hotel, 1,350,000,000. And remember, that's an annual charge, so it can't be allocated over multiple years. I determined that the variable portion of the maintenance, remember there was a fixed 40 million and a variable 40 million. I determined that the variable portion might be a guest service. And then remember, I had furniture costs of 10 million, and I decided that the furniture would probably last 10 years, and so the annual cost was 1 million. That made an overhead amount to be applied of 1,391,150,000. Now, what I did next is there was 500 million of insurance that the company had to spend every year. So I believe the insurance is the one area where the same dollars can't be both overhead and direct, but I don't think we're talking about the same dollars. So the 500 million is just premiums. So I do think that can and should be applied as overhead. In the one case on requirement 3 or part 3, requirement 2, you may remember the one traveler actually had a charge. There actually was a claim filed either on his behalf or because of him, and we're not sure which. And so where that's a direct claim amount that maybe the company will have to pay, we might add that to him. So here I took 250 million of the 500 million and I applied it to transport, and then I took another 250 million of the 500 million and I applied it to guest services. This gave me 690 million to allocate as overhead to the transport department or for the transport department, and 1,641,000,000 and some change to allocate as part of the guest services department. So then you may remember we need to divide by an activity base, and it's a limitation of this case study that this type of departmental overhead rate works better if one department is allocated based on one activity base, like direct labor hours, and another department is allocated on another activity base, like direct materials. But in this case, our direct labor number's better, and really each of them have to have direct labor handled as the activity base. So we wound up with transport dividing by the 1,100,000 and guest services divided by the 1,100,000. And this meant for transport, we're multiplying $627 per every direct labor dollar. And where that says DLH, that's a slightly misleading thing. It should be DL and then $sign. And for guest services, we're allocating $1,492 to every direct labor dollar. So what we could do with those two overhead rates is we could allocate them both to one of the passengers that we were looking at in the last requirement or the last part. And here we had Connor Bill, and there were some specific things that the job cost sheet already showed for him, like his direct labor at 5,500, the day excursion at 550,000, the food at 200, the climate suit at 9,500. But then, and the specific insurance claim that we sustained on his behalf of 225,000. But now we're going to allocate transportation overhead, $627 times 5,500 direct labor dollars, and we get this 3,448,500. We also came up with guest services overhead, and we got that by taking the 1,492 and again multiplying it by the 5,500 direct labor dollars. And when we added up all these numbers, the total estimated cost, and remember this is an estimate, but our total estimated cost for Connor Bill was $12,444,200. So if you remember the earlier work I did, and some of you think about the price you came up with, many of us came up with a price that was less than 12 million. So notice what this analysis says is that if we charged Connor Bill less than 12 million, and we're estimating that he cost us 12,444,200, it leaves us a couple choices, which is the beauty of management accounting. First of all, if our price wasn't fixed, if we estimated to him that it was going to cost 10 or 11 million, but it came in more, we just bill him the whole amount. We could take the 12,444,200 and multiply it by the profit and maybe come up with 14 or 15 million that we charge him. That's not very common because usually the customer will force us, even at high dollars like this, the customer will force us to commit to a price. And if we already committed to a price of 11 million or 12 million or something like this, we may just have to realize, okay, our price wasn't high enough. When we go back and we post new prices, we'll post them a little higher with this knowledge. Well, hopefully you've enjoyed and understood better what we do with activity-based costing. You've seen a little better how to handle the case study. Let me know if you have any questions. Take care.